I'm Wen-chin Ouyang. I'm from SOAS, and my role this afternoon is to chair. So I'll try to sort of not say anything, but let the speakers speak for themselves. But this afternoon session is intended more as an open forum. It's a panel discussion, but we wanted all of you to engage in the discussion. But we have speakers who will kick off the conversation and for you to come in later. So each of them will speak for about 5 to 7 minutes at most, right? And one after the other, and after that we open for your input. So we're going to start with Professor Rajinder Dudrah, who is Professor of Cultural Studies and Creative Industry. Is that what it is? And he will speak for 5 to 7 minutes. And then followed by Selma Dabbagh, who is an author and human rights lawyer. And her book, Out of It, published in 2011, was listed in The Guardian as one of the best books of 2011 and 2012. And next to her is Nicky Harman, who is a prize-winning translator, and she's also here to tell us about how she feels about multilingualism in post-Brexit Britain. Right? Rajinder?
Thank you, Wen-chin. So just some opening comments. So when we were putting together this conference, we thought it was very important that not only were we looking at languages, multilingualism, monolingualism in a historical perspective or an interdisciplinary perspective, but clearly at the time of when the project was announced, when we got the money, Brexit was on the landscape, and then Brexit did happen. So we thought it was very important that a project like this is able to speak to and also make interventions into current political, social, cultural landscapes, not least in the context of Brexit, whether you voted for or against it. But clearly this speaks to that. So this is where this panel came up from, and I really hope that we stick to our 5 to 7 minutes, because it's an hour slot, and this will be then open to the floor, because I know at previous panels could have been a little bit more kind of truncated, so we'll try and certainly aim for that. Now, having said that, here's my challenge. I've got to stick to time. All right, so I want to make some opening comments then, before I get to two ways. I'm going to end with 2 ways of thinking creatively and in a multiple way of how we can interject or come to terms with something like Brexit, whether we voted for or against. And I think that's been exacerbated, not least as it was mentioned before, in terms of US geopolitics, whether it's Trump or, as I learned in Russian yesterday, Trump. So it's one of the two there, okay? All right, so Janice, when she opened up, really gave us a sense of the context of the Auri project, and I thought that was really important. On the one hand then, what we have is this notion of languages not just being functional, but also at the same time what we have is this idea that we are part of something larger than us, being in the UK. We have this sense of the UK being multilingual. Some of us might think, how multilingual is it? And to what extent are languages meaningful or functional in that context? Now let's just pause and stop before the Brexit moment and think about how languages happened in the not too distant past. So here, look at me, my nice pink top, but also my skin color is brown. In the post-war period, our languages, or our community languages, were considered problematic. They were considered problematic in the sense of too much culture. So if you didn't speak English at the time of the immediate post-war context, if you spoke Punjabi, Hindi, Gujarati, South Asian language, or another language in that post-war context, you were considered a problem. And that problem was about assimilation or integration, which then led to multiculturalism. And how do we kind of square that circle, or how do we make sense of these new migrant communities, and how do we make them more British? Now, what's interesting, I use that in a very compressed way, and I know that the history is much more complex than that, but cut to just a few months before Brexit, in households up and down the country, and particularly my household, I was having conversations with second or third generation British Asians, my kith and kin, my friends and family, and my cousins, people who looked like me but didn't wear trendy pink tops like me, were saying, we should be voting for Brexit. What? Why? There are too many bloody immigrants here. So these were brown-skinned, second, third generation British Asians, and the language is changing, the culture is changing. I can't understand what they're saying. So shock and horror, you can imagine what my Christmas card list looked like, and the moral kind of trepidations I had in terms of, right, who do I want to invite round for canapé, not canapés, samosas and chocolate. I've just used canapés because I'm in Oxford. Sorry, excuse me there. Okay, so there's the context then of of languages moving, languages in transition, but also there's a real political imperative at stake here. And people and politics are at stake here, not least in the sense of viewpoints. Okay? Let's also think about language in the sense of discourse and language as meaning, and some of our colleagues this morning have talked a bit about this. The language on Brexit is quite interesting here. So here we have soft Brexit. Before Brexit was triggered, are we going to have a soft Brexit so that somehow we would economically have access to the EU in the way that we did, but we would be able to negotiate and cherry pick how we wanted that relation to him? Clearly now it's being labelled that we're now going to move to a hard Brexit, where actually that's not going to happen and the negotiations are going to be much more tougher. Now that language in itself, that soft and hard, has its own connotations of masculinization, feminization. So is there a sense here where we need to kind of think about the articulation of language and culture and real politics in the sense of how we inhabit language on our bodies, but also in our everyday practices? And this is where I'm very much a cultural studies person coming to this project. I'm not a linguist, and I don't pretend to be a linguist, although I'm quite fluent in Hindi, Punjabi, Urdu, and from yesterday, thanks to Julie, a little bit of Russian, although I can't really claim that. So I'm really very much coming to this from a film, media, and cultural studies perspective, where I'm interested in language and the cultural context of that language, but also the interrelated relationships of the two. Now, just coming back to that notion of the soft and hard Brexit then, what we need to think about here is not just the masculinization and feminization, but what are some of our responses to that? Now, one hard reality of that Brexit is, some of you might have seen the All-Parliamentary Party Group. They released a report, I think it was about October, and they were really concerned about the real loss of languages to skills acquisition in trade and industry. And they came up with that the real sense of loss of that is 3.5%. Now, obviously, we could challenge that statistic and ask about their data and how they come up with it, but there's a hard fact of a real consequence of Brexit. And some of our colleagues this morning talked about the real consequences of language uptake from schools to colleges and then to university. So this landscape really does need to be kind of mapped out, and some futuristic thinking needs to be thought about in that context. But that's all doom and gloom. Come on, we're creative multilingualism. Let's take the multi in multilingualism and let's think about some multi approaches. Multi in the sense of who we are as multi-beings, racist, sexist, antiphobic, anti-language, or even if we voted for Brexit, that's fine. We forgive you. If we voted for Brexit, how do we now work together to make a more meaningful language and culture interaction? 2 examples, then I'm going to finish because it's just coming up to 5.5 minutes. I've got about 1.5 minutes left. So the first is that, drawing on from my own example, before I was invited to be part of this project and I got to know my lovely colleagues here at Oxford, yes, there are some nice people at Oxford, despite all the rumours, the thing that I got to think about was I was in film studies at the University of Manchester for 14 years, from 2002 to just 6 months ago. And there I was teaching film studies in the European Hollywood tradition, from Bollywood, one of my areas of specialism, and world cinema, alongside my languages colleagues as well. So this was an interesting way where we were teaching not only the language of film in the way that some of my colleagues this morning from English were talking about translation and metaphor, but we were kind of breaking down film text in terms of grammar, but then we were also learning about people through their utterances, through their performativity, and how camera angles meant something different in a Hollywood tradition to how camera angles worked in a Bollywood musical tradition. So there was an interesting way in which languages and cultures are coming together, and it's another way, a strategy of rejuvenating or responding to the crisis of languages of, say, 10, 15 years ago, when languages departments were thinking, how do we kind of make ourselves a bit more jazzy or sexy? So there was an alliance, natural or otherwise, with film studies. The second example that I'm going to finish with is the trailer. Notice my film studies background here. The trailer, which is going to lead into the research that I'm doing with Punch Records, who are here, and I'll introduce colleagues in the next session. But we're working together with our colleagues in Russian, and this is where we're thinking about bringing together languages and cultures which you might not assume come together in the first instance. So this is Russian literature, Russian opera, Russian theatre, alongside British Asian languages, Hindi, Urdu, Punjabi, Black British languages, African and Caribbean, together through the music forms of grime, hip-hop, rap, and Bollywood. What happens when you get those languages and cultures in a room together and you get these people to think and perform together? Is this also a creative and a multi-response, not just to the challenges that Brexit poses to us, but also a challenge to us of what kind of human beings we want to be going forward? And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Selma.
Quite an act to follow. I'm not a linguist, as you heard. I'm a writer of fiction. I work in the forms of short stories, novels, and I'm currently working on a film. I also trained as a lawyer, and I worked in international criminal law until quite recently. So in terms of language, I mean, when I was asked to be here, I said, well, I'm actually not... I'm not multilingual, I'm mixed, I'm English-Palestinian, but I grew up with English as very much a main language. So I think I'm something like a lost lingualist. I'm somebody who's lost a language which was in the family. And I think there's a particular sensitivity you have to a language which you've heard around you all your life, but you can't really speak. It's a bit like having a sort of locked-in syndrome where you're sort of nearly there, but you're not quite. And I've spent a long time learning Arabic, and I keep thinking that I'm going to get to the point where it's just going to click and flow, but it never quite does, although my understanding of it is something different. I think in terms of the way that I write as a novelist, when writing about writing characters who speak Arabic as a first language, I've tried very much to somehow place the way that I'm seeing like the Palestinian context within my novel out of it, was to take it up maybe a level to a more impressionistic level, so that I felt that I could get a sort of broader canvas about the situation that I was trying to portray, rather than having it a very close to the ear sense of sort of social realist dialogue. So that's one way that it's affected the way that I write. But I think that there's a lot of other translating out that happens when you're familiar with two cultures in terms of a literary form, and that some Arabic literature, I think, fails to find perhaps an audience in English, not because of any lack of quality or any lack of resonance with its own audience, because perhaps sometimes there are issues like a sensitivity to having a stomach for sentimentality can be very culturally variant, or maybe attitudes towards being polemical or being in some way dogmatic on a political cause. But in terms of the post-Brexit, and really post-Brexit to me is now becoming so trumped in my head, as to the type of world that we're moving into, and where one is as a writer or as a lawyer on a situation like Palestine, there is the feeling that you are writing from behind a wall, which is a feeling that we've always had as Palestinians. You're people who have been effectively written out of history. You are said not to have existed. There are very famous pronouncements of people like Golda Meir saying that the Palestinians aren't there. And then if you go back even further with the creation of the State of Israel, it started with what they knew to be fallacious claim that it was a land without a people for a people without a land, when they knew at the end of the 19th century that it was actually very thickly populated. So there was definitely a usefulness in wiping out a people to take the resources from them. And if we look at some of the language which has come out of Trump recently, we see that he's saying things which are not necessarily negating or different from American foreign policy previously, but the way he says them is very much in your face, as we well know. And on the situation in Iraq, one which I found particularly stunning was him saying, with regards to Mosul, we should have taken the oil, because if we had taken the oil, we wouldn't have ISIS and we would have had the wealth. So it's an outright statement that, we should take it. And it's really a pronouncement of many human rights violations and breaches of the Geneva Conventions, that we should basically plunder and pillage and just go for it, because we can. So it's quite difficult when working as a lot of work which is done in public international law and international criminal law, is that you're working on the shame factor. You're trying to shame governments, even though you know that the legal system may not have the teeth that you want it to have to be able to apply itself against other countries. You want to have some sort of shame, but it's a lot more difficult to work when you're dealing with the entirely shameless. So that's one issue about on the question of walls and Trump. And I think that the way that Palestinians have responded to writing from where they are and the way that they're trying to write their way out into a position where they are seen as being more visible is by using a variety of different languages. We have Palestinian writers, prize-winning Palestinian writers writing in Hebrew like Anton Shamas, and we also have world-renowned poets like Mahmoud Darwish and again, prize-winning English writing writers like Suad Amari, who wrote Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, and Rajat Shahada, who wrote Palestinian Walks. And they all address the question, which Rajat Shahada put very well, of what does the writer do when faced with suffering taking place all around, when one's history and present reality are represented in a distorted manner, when you feel you have no voice and others are speaking for you, misrepresenting your reality. How do you deal with that? How do you, the question which is put is, how do you deal with it? And a lot of inventive forms have arisen to try and get a readership and an audience and an acknowledgement of where the people behind the wall, which is going to be a growing number of people starting very soon with Mexico apparently, is get people to gain some recognition through literary forms, and the approaches to writing has been through a variety of humor, memoir, novel writing, short stories, and poetry, and I think, I don't know, I find it quite, it's a broad subject to address, and I was. And I think that just to sum up in terms of the way that Palestinian literature is distinctive, is that whereas most Western literature has always been presumed to be non-political, Palestinian literature has traditionally been presumed to be political. So we've always been working with a reverse presumption, and that has put its own weight on the way that Palestinians have had to deal with the subject matter and explain out a set of circumstances to an audience that it's hoping to gain sympathy from. But with the sort of attacks on the current sort of liberal Western paradigm, it's like there's a sense of one's not only struggling to gain readership, but one's struggling to gain a readership whose audience matters. So I think, am I getting up to 5 minutes? I'm sorry, thank you.
Okay. I'm speaking as a literary translator. I have a nice picture of Janus looking both ways, of an apparently female Janus, which I rather like. The translator looks both ways, from one language, one culture, to another language, another culture. And I'm now going to wave this book at you, because it was this book, published in Taiwan in the 90s, which really brought it home to me, what a great privilege it is reading literature in another language. Written by a young woman, Taiwan journalist. It was a set of intensely personal essays, and for example, one of them was about a vicious attack which she'd suffered a few years before, in which she'd been raped. And this essay was the first time she had spoken about it because of the shame. And that brought home to me what a huge privilege it was. It's also, at that time I wasn't translating. After I began to translate, I then, another metaphor, thought about translation being not just a window on another world, which reading into another language is a window in another world. It's opening the window for other people. So I'm now going to say a few words about creativity and the creative process when you're translating from Chinese to, obviously, two very different languages. This is from Soul Mountain, written by Gao Xingjian, who won the Nobel Literature Prize for it. If you look at the middle column, that's the, I hate the word literal, but it's, I think it's infamous and ill-used. But anyway, I can't think of any other way of describing it. The middle column, sticking as closely as possible to the Chinese. The second column on the right is Mabel Lee's translation. And she's had to choose, because you do when you translate from Chinese, between using the present tense or the past tense, singular and plural, and she's had to cope with groups of perhaps 4 characters and translating them into one single adjective in English. And the result is very nice. It contains absolutely everything that was in the original Chinese, and it's all admirably succinct. Ah, yes, Chinese and numbers. There's a long, long, age-old tradition, as you can see, 300 BC, in Chinese of using numbers. Numbers give a rhythm. Numbers, sequences of numbers are their own kind of metaphor. And in the classic of the Materia Medica, you have the 4 qi, the 5 flavors, and so on. Great. Well, you wouldn't think it matters in contemporary Chinese, but when it's very literally translated, it does. As you've got Jiang Zemin's political philosophy, the 3 represents the Sanga Daibiao, with a particular meaning, which you can read by, while I'm talking. When it's literally translated, it can lead to incomprehension and even derision, which surely is not Jiang Zemin or his officials' intention. For example, about the particular 3 represents, there was a reputable journalist from The Guardian, from a newspaper, from a national newspaper, who wrote, "The new market socialist ideology is being constructed under the rubric of the 3 represents." Fine. Brackets. "The Chinese love of talking in riddles makes hiding the retreat from Marxism rather easier." So he regarded this use of numbers as the Chinese love of talking in riddles, which of course it isn't. It's simply a stylistic device. But the translator has not gone far enough towards the listeners, towards the readers. Okay, something a bit more overtly political about style. You'll remember Gu Kailai, who was married to Bo Xilai and was convicted of murdering the British businessman Neil Haywood. She was actually a lawyer in her own right, and she wrote How to Win a Lawsuit in the United States. And the New York Times, at the time of her conviction, quoted something from her book. And a colleague and friend of mine, Lucas Klein, who has a website called Notes on the Mosquito, did a very interesting analysis of the New York Times translation of the particular quote. So we've got the New York Times version at the top, and then we've got 2 versions by Klein further down. Each of them has a different register. Each of them is arguably accurate, but I reckon that only the middle one is closest really to the original Chinese in terms of style. Why does it matter? Because, as Lucas himself says, the New York Times coverage of Gu's trial set her up as shrill, frightening, and unsophisticated, simply with the choice of tone in the first translation. I don't know who the translator is because the name wasn't given. So there are political implications and, of course, cultural and social implications in the choice of tone when you're translating. And finally, I haven't really had time to say much about other roles of the literary translator, especially between languages which are very different and where people haven't read a lot of them. But I think I'd like to focus on the very last one, the translator. And translation as a process is a bridge between two cultures.
Oh, thank you very much. Would Maya like to ask questions? Yes?
You're the chair.
Yes, okay. Maya, I think we have a 10-year-old with us, Maya, who would like to ask the panelists a few questions. Yes, go ahead.
Do you think people will read less European literature as a result of Brexit?
Less European.
Yes. So we've been like skirting around the issue of Brexit and multilingualism, and Maya has done a wonderful job by bringing us back right to the questions. So do we think people will read less European literature as a result of Brexit? Does anybody want to contribute to that, right? I think all day today, and I'm going to try to warm up a little bit, we've been hearing two contradictory messages about multilingualism in Britain. On the one hand, right, and someone who likes me who live on bus route 29, when I get on the bus in London, I hear many, many languages, but rarely English on that bus. So there's thriving multilingualism in Britain, right? But all of us who are engaged in teaching modern languages at universities or in high schools, right, as we've been hearing today, is that, you know, modern languages are not being taught very well. Perhaps students are losing interest in learning other languages, and then at the university level, modern languages department are not necessarily recruiting very well. And in the sort of that middle of all that, the Brexit for me seems to be sort of a mark, a signifier of something. Is either sort of the end of the process of long-term disinterest in modern languages or learning other languages, right? Or it is another signpost or something much worse that will come. I'm being provocative, I hope, right? So, in a sense, you know, is Brexit? Brexit, is it part and parcel of an ideological program, right? That will isolate us more within a country, and that rejects other cultures, right, and other languages at the same time. And how is that going to translate in terms of policies, right, at universities, at schools, and so on and so forth. So in a sense, you know, there's this worry, at least among sort of my friends and people I speak to, is that the sense of rejection of multilingualism, rejection of other languages and other cultures. But this time, we're not necessarily thinking about Arabic or Chinese, these more exotic languages, but we're thinking more about Eastern European languages, right? Polish, Hungarian, and so on and so forth. So is Brexit, after Brexit, I mean, is that the direction that we see as a culture we're going into, right? Do we have, yes?
I just wanted to ask, what is global Britain that Lisa May is referring to? Does that mean that we are going to distance ourselves from the EU policy, and the future generations start learning some new languages, or maybe languages from the Commonwealth and other countries that Britain will be trading with?
Right.
Or will that approach incorporate all the good policies that were suggested by the EU, even adopted in Scotland and so on? And my question is, can Britain really negotiate that okay, we don't want to be part of Europe, but then we should be global? Is that contradictory in a way?
Okay, all right. Comments or, yes, Nicky, yeah.
Can I go back to Maya's question?
Yeah.
I'm not sure that, I mean, I know mostly about translations, and I think it's realistic to talk in terms of how many people will read translations from European languages or other languages, because between us, we may know like 1, 2, 3 languages, but if we read translations, we can get access to so many more languages. And to be honest, I don't think very many people are reading books in translation anyway, from any language. And I think the situation has been slowly improving over the last few years. But whether it's going to get worse from now on, I'm not sure. I'd just like to tell you about a very wonderful Translated Literature Award, which happened this week, the Marsh Award for Children's Literature in Translation, where the winner was a Chinese book, or rather the translator of a Chinese book, called Bronze and Sunflower. And it's a book for 9 to 13-year-olds, and it's a wonderful novel. And it's now available in a really good English version. So I do hope people will read it and buy it for their kids, and I do hope that you will read it. That's all. Plug for the Marsh Award.
Here that we have comment, I hope, or response.
Thanks. Yes, in response to the question, I think it's too early to say. I'm encouraged by the younger generations who seem to be very keen to stay in the European Union. And I think that one of the consequences of Brexit could be that there's a certain solidarity among younger people with the idea of other European languages. And I think that there could be a potential for a greater interest. In terms of translated literature, that's a different matter, because certain publishers rely on funding from the EU, but perhaps the projects that are going on at the moment that we've been talking about today will create a new situation where, you know, we can be optimistic. I think it's very important not to fall into a trap of thinking that it's all doom and gloom, because we have to accept that a lot of people who did vote Brexit are themselves multilingual people. I mean, in a part of London near where I live, which is one of the most multicultural parts of London and multilingual parts of London, 47% of Tower Hamlets voted to leave. So there are people who speak many languages who we've got to engage with, who actually voted to leave. And also, if you look at older generations of people in the north of England especially, who supposedly voted heavily to leave, they're likely to be some of the remaining dialect speakers of English, non-standard English. So we've got to be careful not to equate the idea of creative multilingualism with a political decision.
Okay, first, and then, briefly, and then we have someone at the back.
Thank you. I'm very worried. I'm French, and I'm not for Brexit, of course. And I feel that if we go back to books, reading and translating, because this is a topic, not politics, that we have here, that the English business of publishing is going to become even more insular. If you go to the equivalent of Waterstones in Paris, which is FNAC, and you go to the tables, etc., you will find that the areas of translated books is quite large and well displayed on tables. I happen to know personally the English writer David Lodge, and he's told me that actually he sells more of his books in French translation than he does in this country. So the French are used to import other literature and read them. If you try to find a French book a recent one, not the big classics, Balzac, etc. They are not translated into English. And it has to be a very special story, like Irène Nemirovsky, La Suite Française, because it's a book that had been discovered, 50 years later by a writer who perished in the Holocaust 50 years. And it has to have a very special story. So to go back to my point, sorry, is I am very worried that Brexit is going to increase, as I said earlier, the sense that English is the universal language, and you know, so all these problems do not exist.
We have paradoxes here. We're working with paradoxes. Okay, very good. We have, yeah.
In response to languages and worrying, I understand you're worrying about French and all global languages. I think being optimistic, it's our job as language educators, if it's lecturers or teachers or anyone who works in the language industry, to keep the wheel going and to create that global unity. It doesn't matter where it is, if it's in Europe, if it's in America, through languages and culture. It's down to us as educators to keep that going and to be positive. Whatever the outcome of the Brexit, we can make it, because we are the creator of the linguistic work that's been done previously, and it's wonderful work is being done, and we should actually take it from where it stopped to the next level, hopefully.
Do we have more questions from the young girl? Did she have more questions?
She might have, but you go ahead.
Should you say there were a few?
Her come around.
No, that was my point.
Do we have a question?
I'm more interested in her
question. Do you have more question you want to ask?
Do you think less English books will be translated into European languages, or they will be translated into Chinese or Arabic?
God, we have to do statistics. Okay. I do Chinese and Arabic, so let's see. And I haven't done the studies very well, but I know sort of like, for example, I don't know about translating from English, but if you go to bookshops in Taiwan, bookshops in China, you know, all the bestsellers in English, all the books about Trump, about Theresa May, about Tony Blair when he was prime minister, these were like instant translations. You publish today and they're translated the next day into Chinese. Harry Potter, before they were published in English, they were already published in Chinese. So in a sense, you know, there's that vibrant translation movement in Chinese. All the books I know that I've read in English are available in Chinese. But that brings us to sort of the sort of question that you raised earlier and other questions is about, and I think about concern that less is being translated into English, which is true, I think, in terms of English. And I think the situation is getting much, much better these days. Much less, right, compared with translation into other languages, much less is being translated into English. A lot has been translated. And this is about Arabic literature, right? Spanish, Italian, German, Dutch, right? French. But compared with these languages, right, there's much less is being translated into English. As for Arabic into Chinese, there's now sort of like a growing translation movement, right, to translate Arabic texts into Chinese, right? So that there's that going on. But the sort of like it depends on the scholars of Arabic in China and Taiwan, right? How much Arabic they know. Right, so they translate whatever, and there are very few of them. And now there's also, right, there's less translation from Chinese into Arabic, right, but the Chinese are doing it themselves. All right, so that's, okay. Anybody wants to answer questions about other languages? Less translation into English? Or, okay, any other questions or, right there.
Just in terms of one of the consequences post-Brexit, I think that one of the great tragedies will be the lack or the loss of our participation in the Erasmus program. And I'm thinking of this not about the linguists, because the linguists, you're preaching to the converted, and I think everyone in the room here is the converted. The linguists will go and seek their opportunities. But the Erasmus program was set up really with the mathematicians and the scientists in mind, so that those people, so language wasn't just, or learning and speaking and acquiring languages wasn't just reserved for those people who wanted to study it. And I think it's an enormous issue for Britain afterwards. And I think for me it becomes also a very big social mobility issue, because it will be replaced by something. It still will be possible for young people to go to European universities. But from what I understand about the Swiss model, it's become extremely expensive. And one of the joys of an Erasmus exchange was that it was so well funded and it allowed people from all backgrounds to access something. And I'm really concerned that with this, language learning becomes the domain of those who've chosen to do it, rather than those who can add it to another range of skills, and it becomes the domain and the right of the wealthy. And I think that's a real concern for how many people can learn languages and the opportunities that they're given.
And then we have some, please.
Yeah, hi, I'm Michael Gratzka, I'm the chair of UCML, and I completely agree with you that there is a danger that languages study and study abroad for non-linguists may become an economic issue to a much larger extent, but it already is. So study abroad in China, in Russia, in Latin America is already quite expensive because there is no equivalent funding available. Now, regarding Erasmus+, there is actually a bumper budget available right now. People should know that. Institutions should apply for that, and in all likelihood in 2018 there again will be the funding. Nothing is lost right now. And the next step is participation in Erasmus+ and also in the European research framework like Horizon 2020 is not actually dependent on EU membership. So if this country negotiates in a way we would like the country to negotiate, we may actually just continue participating in these programs. And it will be very important for all of us in political discourse, in dialogue with MPs, with government ministers, with decision makers, to stress these points. If we go for the so-called hard Brexit, it may mean the loss of Erasmus+ and European research funding, but it doesn't have to.
Okay. Anyone else? Before I okay, please.
Thank you. It's a question for the panel relating to xenophobia and the fact that so few non-English texts are translated into English, especially more recent ones, and whether you think that may have had an impact on the fear of immigration and the other and the resulting Brexit vote.
Okay, it's time to turn back to the panel.
Yeah, sure. Just pick up on a couple of those things. I mean, let's deal with the xenophobia question or the wider issue. I mean, there was no doubt that in the lead up to Brexit that it was used as a tool not only as a language but also as a rhetoric and discourse to deliberately stoke up the polarization. Now we're in the post-Brexit mode and we know that some of those images, those words that were used were just completely political ball playing in the kind of worst sense of that, as it were. But now we're in this post-Brexit landscape. The challenge is really for us, and to connect it back to what the woman at the end said, we're all in some ways connected to the language industry. And so in what ways are we going to respond? One response for us is as either scholars or scholars who consider themselves as doing some sort of knowledge exchange, widening participation or activist work, is to think about how some of our theoretical and intellectual ideas, as we've seen and heard today on this project, also can become political tools or ways of intervening, either intervening in the curriculum, in classrooms, but then also through our relationships with our stakeholders and our projects, but also hopefully new relationships that we have from conversations like this and the other projects that are happening up and down the country, that these are new possibilities to respond to that. And it's also interesting that it's timely that it's a 4-year project. So with projects like this, there is an opportunity to build into, for example, we never thought we were going to have a panel on Brexit. when we called the program, it was on our radar, but then as it happened, we thought, hang on, we felt that we needed to respond to this in some way. And then the second thing about the actual numbers and the economics, this goes back to the issue of languages and culture. Let's not forget that that figure that I threw out with the all-parliamentary group, 3.5%, that languages can have an impact on GDP according to their estimates. I think it's also an onus on us in the language industries, broadly defined, of how we gather that data about how much we contribute to language, culture, and society in various ways through our annual reports, through our board meetings, or through various forums like this, but also other political interventions. But also, if we do have hard facts and figures and economics, when it comes to that game, actually we're losing this because of the implication of that, or we have this to gain, but this is an oversight, and the new form of Erasmus is beginning to look like this, but here is the economic cost, or I don't know, the benefits, dare I say, of this. I think that kind of language will also sit quite nicely, but I think will be very, very important as we articulate language alongside culture more and more.
Generally, in writing fiction about the kind of subjects I wrote fiction about, you obviously, part of the aim, what I was trying to say, is that you are trying to depict people in a way that will disturb stereotypes and make people more accessible and get through and get a greater comprehension. And I think with fiction, it's really, the way that I always saw it is just as the first peg. It's just it's the first, it gives people a soft way of moving into a hostile terrain or an unknown terrain, and then later on they can follow it up by reading non-fiction books to get a clearer understanding and of the other, etc. I mean, it's a way to how to manage how it affects stereotypes is difficult to measure, but it's always been the hope. But I think there was actually, I think you said that it got worse, but I think there'd actually been an improvement. I mean, it's a tiny percentage of literary translations into English compared to other European countries. We are, I think, pitiably low, but it had been going up. There had been an improvement pre-Brexit. I don't think there are any figures out since then, but yeah.
Well, yeah, back up what Selma said, really. The situation has been getting better. More people are reading translated literature in the UK than I don't think at this stage we could possibly talk about whether Brexit has already made it worse or whether it's going to make it worse. I mean, I don't want to sound defeatist, but how many people read novels anyway? I do. I spend a lot of my time reading them. I think that literature can contribute enormously to understanding another country, another culture, and therefore combating xenophobia. Yeah. And I don't think it's easy to quantify that. But I guess I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing if I didn't believe that's true.
And I think a very positive example of in New York Times, New York Review of Books, they had an article about, the two big blockbusters, one was The Knausgård and the other one was Ferrante. In terms of sort of, this is where we are at now, great sagas, epic sagas. One was from Norwegian and one from Italian, and they were huge bestsellers. They couldn't sort of translate them fast enough to get them out. So I think there's that kind of, that's a very new phenomenon, which is very positive.
Okay, we can take two more questions. Here is one, and at the end, at the back.
Hi, so I just wanted to ask a bit about this kind of issue which I see, which I think you're probably totally aware of, which is the fact that it seems that, I guess, languages learnt at home are just not taken as seriously as languages that you might just find in a classroom. So, we might respect the idea of, going out and learning French, or even something that's maybe a more palatable, I think this goes back to what you're saying about problematic community languages, obviously, as you put it. Even something like Norwegian or something is still quite safe, I suppose. And whereas something like learning, Polish or Pashto or whatever is not going to be taken seriously. And there's a lack of, why isn't it okay for kids who don't come from those backgrounds to learn these languages in school with their friends who speak those languages? And that would obviously just promote so much kind of social cohesion, and it'd be so nice. But obviously it's also linked to, I guess, the lack of acknowledgement of the literatures of those countries, because if you haven't got those literatures to access to make kids excited about learning those languages, it's going to be hard. But then maybe their friends or something. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that or hopes for the future, if there's any way that it can get better, even in this post-Brexit landscape.
We see another person with questions, so maybe we'll take the questions together and answer them together, and it's about time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Singaporean, so I just came here last year to do an MA in literary translation in Norwich. So it has been a very new experience for me, not just going into literary translation, but as a Chinese Singaporean coming into the UK, which is a new environment and going through so many changes. I'm just wondering that, what do you guys think that in the light of such big or unexpected or even shocking and instabilities because of Brexit and Trump, what's the probability, or is it how realistic or even idealistic it would be to take an optimistic view that in this kind of situations, it might actually push people or throw more spotlight into the role of translation or literature or other cultures and stuff, like to push people towards seeking translated literature, for example, to find meaning or to try to make sense of this kind of situation? Like, do you think it's an overly optimistic view? Is it always going to be, is it going to be a definite negative sort of impact?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, is it too early to be optimistic or pessimistic about Brexit? I suppose that's a question. All right. Now we have two questions, and would you like to take these on?
Sure, okay. I think we should be ready for the challenge that lies ahead. I don't think it is too early to be pessimistic or optimistic. I'm cautioning on the side of the former right now, not least with certain declarations that are being made by so-called leaders or want-to-be leaders across Europe in the context of the Brexit vote and post-Trump as well, and also what Trump is doing most recently, I think in the last 24 hours, about banning certain countries or Muslims from particular kinds of countries. So I think we should be ready definitely for the challenge. That certainly is the context. And also I think, we're talking here about literature and fiction. I think that is one part of the wider puzzle or the challenge. And I think my literature colleagues will kind of probably have words with me afterwards, but I don't think literature is not the only answer here. I think coming back to the plea that I made about the multi, I think we really need to think here about popular culture in its variant forms. Let's take inspiration from the fantastic, fantastic global movement of the Women's March. Look at the styles of performativity, the slogans, the kind of politicking that came out. We all saw these on social media or Facebook. One of my favorites was the women dressed as suffragettes coming back holding placards, "I came back for this shit." So in some senses, history has changed, but in other senses it hasn't. But how are we prepared in terms of going to draw on the resources of history as politics, but also how are we going to intervene as history as our present and our future, which is also very much coming back to your question about the community language. It's also thinking about the ebbs and flows and cycles of this. In one context, those community languages, those post-war community languages, were very problematic because they didn't fit into a version of post-war Britain or Englishness, and these languages were problem, but then they soon became fashionable via food, curry, chicken tikka masala, and now, wait for it, hold on a minute, China is rising, BRIC countries are rising, and somehow we have to do trade with them. Even though we want to be global, but we want to be insular, somehow we still have to have a sense of knowing them and doing transactions. So these languages that were problematic then are now also quite useful in an international and global context. Is the same to be thought about in terms of these other languages which are currently problematic now? So I think we really need to be prepared for those challenges, but also we need to be savvy and think about the long game as well.
On that very, very interesting and positive note, perhaps we should stop and have coffee, right? And then come back for the later sessions. And thank you very much. And panelists, thank you very much.